Alistair Carmichael.
I can justify the decision to go into Afghanistan in 2001. I supported it, and I still support the work our troops are doing there. I think one of the most unforgivable things that this government has done in the last 13 years was then, in 2003, to take our eye off the ball, to embark in an illegal and unnecessary war in Iraq, which exposed our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan to unnecessary risk. It turned the local population against them, and it made the work, the very necessary work that we went into Afghanistan to do, that much more difficult to achieve. That is the strategic challenge that faces the new government, and that is the mess for which the old one must now be held accountable.
Thank you. Alex Salmond.
I think Alistair makes very strong points. I mean, the two cases are different. Iraq was an illegal war. You know, there's been a lot of debate in this election campaign about the success or stability of having a majority government. If taking this country and misleading it into an illegal war in Iraq is an example of majority government, then I think it's high time we had a balanced parliament. In terms of Afghanistan, then, I think the real danger is that we've now been in Afghanistan for some 9 years. The conflict's gone on longer than the First World War. 281 British soldiers have died. They haven't had the right equipment. And what I'd point to is the fact that President Obama is talking about the withdrawal, or starting the withdrawal, of American forces by July of next year. Why can't we have a similar commitment to withdraw forces or start to withdraw them by July of next year?
Jim Murphy.
I think that we've been very clear that there was, of course, a failure across the world in post-conflict planning in Iraq. It was impossible to predict the scale of difficulty that was there, but there was a mistake in that planning, and we've been very clear about that. Now, turning to Afghanistan, it is essential, it's fundamentally important that we win that war in Afghanistan because of the brutality of the regime that was in place there. And I'm very clear that we either fight terrorism and the most vicious type of horrible, hate-filled politics in the dusty streets of Afghanistan, or we end up fighting it in the busy streets of our cities here in Britain.
Thank you.
Joanna, I don't know if the others have, but I've been out to Afghanistan. I've met our troops serving there, and we all owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. It is a really tough job, and whilst they're there, we have to give them our fullest support. What I think is shameful, though, is the way in which they have been treated, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, by this Labour government. Particularly in Afghanistan, soldiers had to walk into the conflict when they should have been being helicoptered in, and because of that, we lost extra lives. That's shameful, and Jim, you should be ashamed about that.
Joanna was also asking, I think, basically whether you've reassessed your positions on either of the wars, seeing the civilian casualties, which there have been. Well over 100,000, I think, generally agreed, have died in Iraq, and similar numbers possibly in Afghanistan.
I haven't reassessed my position because, along with Alistair, I strongly opposed the invasion of Iraq. Now, a few seconds ago, Jim said there was mistakes in post-war planning in Iraq, and most certainly there were, but surely the biggest mistake was to go into Iraq in the first place, now that we know there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Many of my friends are Scots who are Kurdish. They lost loved ones, they lost mums and dads and sons and daughters at the hands of Saddam Hussein in his vile chemical weapons attacks in places like Halabja. They believed there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The United Nations Security Council, including countries like Syria, believed there were chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction, but we were wrong. We didn't find those weapons of mass destruction, but I do believe, Adam, that the world is a better place with Saddam Hussein no longer being in power in Iraq.
This is a rewriting of history. This is a rewriting of history. Remember the work that Hans Blix was doing in the run-up to the starting of the war in Iraq. Remember the way that that was systematically undermined by Tony Blair and the rest of the Labour government. If we had allowed the Hans Blix and the weapons inspectors to do their work, then we could have found out the truth. But the fact of the matter is, and we know this now, Tony Blair had already told George Bush, that we would be standing behind him, that the Britain would support him if he went to war in Iraq. And at the same time, he was telling the House of Commons that even at this, the 11th hour, Saddam Hussein could still stand back, he could still walk away if he would be prepared to cooperate. That was the way in which we were systematically misled. And Adam says 100,000 Iraqis have died. We don't know, because your government and Tony Blair didn't even have the decency to count them.
You know, I think if there was a shred of evidence for what Jim Murphy is saying, why did the Labour Party persistently block the holding of an independent inquiry into the Iraq war, which they did?
And a bit of inquiry before the vote wouldn't have gone amiss either, David, and
yes,
that was kind of lacking from your benches.
But we need to learn the lessons. It was persistently refused, and it's obvious now that one of the main reasons for that was the evidence which Gordon Brown gave to that inquiry, that during the period of the Iraq war, Labour cut our defence spending.
One of the great problems was that the Tory party supported Tony Blair in the illegal invasion of Iraq and made it impossible. But how can you, Jim, after all that we now know, that we know definitely there weren't weapons of mass destruction, with that knowledge, how can you still justify an illegal invasion of a country which cost innumerable lives, certainly more than 100,000?
Alec, the fact is that in advance of that conflict, the United Nations thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The Kurds who were slaughtered in their tens of thousands knew they had used weapons of mass destruction. There was numerous United Nations resolutions. The Labour government, Tony Blair, tried again and again to get Saddam Hussein to comply with those UN resolutions, but he refused to do so. But of course, it's clear now that there was a mistake. There were no weapons of mass destruction, but in all good faith, we took a decision that was to try and liberate Iraq from a tyrant who we believed to have weapons of mass destruction. And of course, there were mistakes. After the conflict. Of course, the collapse of the Iraqi army wasn't envisaged in the way that it was, but, Adam, it was done at the time because there was a belief that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
You're still justifying.
Believe that if you want, but the fact is that as we speak here today, our troops are engaged in a very, very difficult conflict in Afghanistan. And I think it's right that we should remember why it is we went in there. And to remember, in fact, this isn't just about what happens in Afghanistan. You have to put Afghanistan in its proper place in its region. And the fact is, if we walk away from Afghanistan before we have stabilised the country, then it will only be a matter of time before any government we leave behind falls. And once that goes, Pakistan will be the next to follow, and then you'll have a jihadist government that has its fingers on a nuclear trigger, and I don't think that's good for any country in the world.
Well, the reason that there has to be a reassessment is that we went into Afghanistan to protect us from Al-Qaeda. We've spent the last 9 years with our brave troops, and we're all agreed on that, in a battle against the Taliban. And if the President of the United States can put a timescale of July next year on the start of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, then why on earth cannot the United Kingdom parties and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
David Munda.
Well, what the priority, if there is a Conservative government, will be to ensure that our troops who are in Afghanistan have the equipment and the resources that they need to do the job, because they have been let down badly by this Labour government. But we will also take the war in Afghanistan seriously. We will have a war cabinet, not a sofa cabinet.
Jim Murphy, you've got about 10 seconds.
It's essential that we continue to investigate our fantastically brave men and women who are out there in the dust and danger of Afghanistan the best possible equipment, more helicopters, more armoured personnel, vehicles. But it's also essential that we put more pressure on the Afghani government to do their job. They take more responsibility for security, for policing, and help to build a country that people have a stake in.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there. Now we're going to move on.